This is Pete Topping, the Peconic Baykeeper, and we're at Cold Spring Pond in Southampton. This is the site of our floating oyster nursery out here. So what we have is 15 floating oyster cages. Right now they're actually flipped the opposite way, and one of the nice things with these cages is we can flip them to air dry them and remove fouling, and also get to the oysters more easily. And it's a higher tide right now, so what we have is this system is rigged on a pulley line. So I'm standing here in the shallows and I'm able to just pull these cages in. So I actually flipped these yesterday because they were getting a bit fouled. They've been drying overnight, and now it's time to check on everything, and then we'll flip them back over. Okay. So I pulled these cages in. Each one has these 3 bungees on it, and then I can open this right up. And I'm just going to take a look at these to kind of check on them. These are our oysters from this year. It might be a little difficult to see. Maybe I can open a bag up here. We have these zip ties kind of hold them in place. And if I open this up, each bag has quite a few oysters in it. So these are our oysters. You can see they're growing pretty good size. There's a bit of a size variation with these, but this is oyster seed from this year that we got through a shellfish hatchery. These oysters are, even though they're a little bit bigger, their shells are pretty thin. So if I were to squeeze these, say I was a blue crab or another predator, it'd be pretty easy for me to pop these open. So if we were to put these back in the water now at the end of the season, the survival rate would actually be pretty low. So there wouldn't be too much reward for all the effort of growing these through the season. So what we do, and we'll see this a little bit later, is we actually keep these oysters over winter. We put them in a deeper water spot out in Great Peconic Bay. And then we work with our good friends at Happy Oyster Company, who always give us a hand lifting them up from the bottom in the spring. And then we'll actually put these in the cages for a second season. So by doing that, we get a much bigger, stronger oyster. Even though we lose a few over the winter time, that's kind of just what happens. The rate of survival for the ones that we're actually putting out is going to be much higher. So we're focusing much more on the quality of our oysters rather than the quantity. So this year we have a crop of 150,000 or so baby oysters, and if we're lucky, we'll seed about 100,000, sometimes more, sometimes less. There's a lot of variables that go into this that we'll be putting out. And in a little bit, we'll see what some of those second year oysters look like. So these cages have been drying since yesterday morning. It's cooler out this time of year, so we're not worried too much about any damage to the oysters, but we do want to kill off any of the fouling organisms like tunicates or barnacles, seaweed, things like that might be trying to grow. And the great thing about this system is once these have air dried, I just flip it over like that, and then you'll see I have these spikes on top of these pontoons. So one of the concerns with floating aquaculture gear is that this gear makes really great habitat, which is normally a good thing, especially for blue crabs and shrimp and even silver sides and other bait fish. But it's also really good roosting habitat for birds. And you might think that's a good thing, and it's definitely good to have roosting habitat for birds. But when you get a lot of terns or cormorants on these floats, that waste can have a localized impact on water quality. So this is a pretty small scale operation, not too much of a concern. But you can imagine if you were a commercial grower and growing oysters for consumption, how that could potentially be a problem. So we've used these bird spikes. They're just temporarily attached. So far this season, they've been working really well. Again, we want to provide habitat for birds, but we also want to minimize those localized impacts of having too many birds in one place. All right, so we flipped all our cages of this year's baby oysters, and now it's time to kind of take a look and see what we have from last year's oysters. Typically we would do this a little bit more from shore or sometimes on the boat, but I'm going to do it from the water just so I can show everyone what's going on. So I want to give them a nice shake and dump those oysters right in this tote here. And so those oysters we saw earlier, the biggest ones were maybe an inch or so in size. And if you remember, I talked about how fragile their shells were. You can see this oyster is probably about 3 inches or so in size. And these are actually some of our smallest oysters from last year. Our biggest ones have already been seeded. So these are actually, a lot of them are actually what you would consider a legally harvestable adult oyster, which is good news because their shells are really tough. It's going to make them more vulnerable to predators. They're of reproductive age. And even more good news is we're going to actually be putting all these oysters in shellfish sanctuaries that the Southampton Town trustees, in their wisdom, have created. So not all towns have these shellfish sanctuaries. We worked with Southampton Town trustees last year actually to create a new, smaller sanctuary right here in Cold Spring Pond. So we're trying to test out how well that works out. And we're also, as a nonprofit, we're doing this. We have corporate sponsorship through Advanced Wastewater Solutions, DeLandro Andrews Engineering, and this year we actually received some grant funding from the New York Community Trust. So that's really what's supporting this effort, and because we're being supported for this as a nonprofit, we're trying to make sure all these oysters go back for restoration rather than some other programs where they might be going back on an open bottom that they'd then be able to be harvested from. All right, so we pulled 2 cages worth of oysters, so that's 6 bags, and we ended up with about 240 liters. We used these calipers to measure a bunch and get averages. And then we also did a estimate of counts per liter, so we can extrapolate that and get an idea. So we have 4 totes here, and it's a little over 11,000 oysters. So looking pretty good. These are 11,000 really nice looking oysters that are going to go into this sanctuary here. We're going to put them closer to the shoreline where we've already assessed the bottom. It's a firmer bottom that's going to support these. Oysters are really great for the environment. They filter water, they provide habitat. If oysters build into reef, they can break up wave energy. And once they're established, they'll actually naturally propagate and sometimes set even on the rib mussels along the marsh here. So it's really building the foundation for this estuarine ecosystem, which really needs all the support it can get right now. So that's what we're trying to do.